Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner practitioner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And thank you so much for listening today. Really appreciate your time. And if this is the first time listening, welcome to the podcast. On today's episode, I have an interesting conversation with Ben Collier and Dan Korolev of Collier Optical Lab. And Dan, Ben, and I, we talk about how they built Collier Optical Lab as an independent lab. We talk about the differences and benefits of working with an independent lab in your practice. We talk about how an independent lab can positively impact the patient experience, the profitability of your practice, and your ability to remain independent as you grow and own your practice. And we also talk about how other business partners and other vendors fit into that as well, and how important the relationships are between any business and the partners that they do business with. So this was an interesting conversation. We'll throw all of Collier Optical Lab's information in our show notes, which you can find at the Education Hub on my website, www.optometrywealth.com/education. And while they're there, take a look at all the other resources and podcast episodes and articles we've done. And you can also schedule a no-commitment introductory call. And we can talk about whatever's on your mind financially, as well as how we serve optometrists nationwide, master their cash flow, better prepare for taxes, and plan more proactively financially. It's just been an incredible, fun, busy time for the business right now, just with all the student loan stuff sort of coming to an end. But I've been blessed and fortunate to help optometrists navigate so many financial questions and topics, both inside and outside of the practice. So reach out if you have any questions. Of course, go to my website, reach out at Evon, EVON, at optometrywealth.com. And in the meantime, without further ado, here is my conversation with Ben Collier and Dan Korolev. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mendrin. And on today's episode, I am excited to be joined by two special guests, Ben Collier and Dan Korolev of Collier Optical Lab. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, Evon, thanks. Good to be back on the show with you.
Yeah.
And thank you for having us.
Yeah, Dan, welcome for the first time. Ben, you and I have talked before and had a different conversation. So happy to have you back on and talk about some updates in your journey, your business. And today's conversation, I want to talk about the benefits of working with an independent lab in an optometry practice. There's a lot of conversation right now, and rightly so, about trying to maintain the independence of eye care professionals and the independence of optometry practices. And I think a lot of that ties into as well with the partners that any business works with. Do they share the same values? Are they independent in themselves? So I'm excited to talk with you both about just the benefits and the differences of working with an independent optical lab versus some of the larger ones. And before I dive into that, just give me a little bit about a brief background for the two of you. Tell us, Ben, about the new business. Tell us about how you two are working together. Tell us about the lab in general.
Yeah, thanks, Evon. So Collier Optical Lab is the newest independent lab in the U.S. We launched in June. The plans for the lab didn't even start until January of this year. So really, I think as far as I know, the fastest lab launch in history, probably in the U.S. So Dan and I, we've worked together for, 15 plus years now. We've met together in banking in New York years ago before I got in the optical world. And we branched off in different career directions. Dan has done a lot in the corporate banking and entrepreneurial world while I got to know the optical world. He helped me launch the financing side of my first lab back in 2020. And so now Dan and I have gotten a chance to partner again with Collier Optical Lab. So I'll let him give you some background on where he comes from.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I'm a commercial banker by trade. I've done most commercial banking for larger institutions, JP Morgan Chase, worked for Bank of America, several other banks. My path led me to entrepreneurship. As it relates to the Collier Optical and optical business altogether, one of my clients in the banking was Ben's initial employer. So I got to see the financial side of running Optical Laboratory. And, fast forward, 15 years, I've worked with numerous customers in different industries and allowed me to gather a lot of statistics and really approach optical work from the financial standpoint. That's where Ben and I connect together, and we have an additional layer of assistance to optometrists that we work with. So that's really my background and my tie-in into the industry.
Perfect. Yeah. And for those that are listening who are either early practice owners or are thinking about getting into practice ownership, maybe they're thinking about cold starting or purchasing a practice down the road, and really just for my benefit as well as someone who's sort of seeing this from the outside in, can you describe how the relationship works between an optometry practice, a private optometry practice, and an optical lab?
Oh yeah, it's a hand-in-hand relationship, really, if you think about it. And from my perspective too, on the lab side, if I have a business that my reputation to my customer, which would be an optometrist, of course, or an optician, if my reputation depends almost entirely on what another company does, I'm going to have a really tight relationship with that company. And that's where the ECP, the private practice lab relationship lies. With frames, that's a huge part of your reputational cost, your reputation. But you can change them out if there's something wrong. You can take care of it. Now with labs, you're at the mercy of your lab. So if you've chosen a lab partner whose values don't align with your values as a private practice owner, then you're going to have some issues that you're going to run into with that misalignment, because the lab is, and to a large degree, carrying the cost, the weight of the reputation of the private practice owner while that job is there and the patient is eagerly waiting for it. So it needs to be a really close relationship. And that's where private independent labs come into play. With all the corporate consolidation, we bring a different level of relationship to the private practice as a lab.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. And again, you're hearing, like we mentioned earlier, you're hearing that same conversation and figuring out how can optometry practices become more independent and free of outside influence on revenue, on profitability, on frame decisions, inventory decisions, things like that. And so that definitely, I'm sure that resonates with a lot of the listeners who are also striving towards that. And when you look at the profit and loss of most optometry practices, or at least those who have an optical, and when you look at their practices, there's two ways basically to increase profitability. It's to increase revenue or to control costs. And the largest levers of those practices is likely to be staff costs and cost of goods sold. And when you talk about an independent lab versus some of the others, how can an independent lab help a practice control those costs of goods in a way that maybe a larger lab can't?
Yeah, really, there's the key area for controlling cost of goods from a lab standpoint is going to, of course, you're talking about what are your lenses, what are your AR coatings, and it's going to come down to being able to pick products and pick a lab that has a cost, pricing, service model that really aligns with your business. So at the end of the day, lowering your lab bill or raising your revenue on the lab side, as you said, those are the two ways that you're going to change your cost of goods. Raise your revenue, lower your lab bill. That's pretty much, those are the only choices you have. You can't order less lenses. If you do, you're getting less patients. So where an independent lab is going to come in is there's not as much corporate weight, name brands, and marketing behind the cost structure of your average independent lab. There are lens options, product options out there now that are not dictated by brand name recognition and tens of millions of dollars of marketing budget. And so those inherently carry less cost to them because of the way that the lens technology has changed, especially over the last 15 to 18 years. So a savvy practice owner is going to look at all their options. Now, does that mean they're going to choose an independent brand of lenses? Not necessarily. Maybe they choose to go with a bigger name brand and they have a business decision for making that choice. As long as they recognize that the trade-off with those decisions is potentially higher cost of goods. It's really all about making an informed decision for your private practice with your values and making sure that what you're purchasing and who you're purchasing from align with those values.
Is, from what you've seen and from the conversations you're having with your customers, your clients, and other practices, are patients concerned? Are the optometrist patients concerned with brand name of the frames? Should practitioners be more concerned about the quality or the design? Does that brand name carry any weight as it did in the past? Is that something that should be top of mind? Like where does that brand name fit of maybe the larger brands fit in versus differences in design or quality or whatever else may be a factor there?
Yeah, that's a key point, and I think obviously you're going to get a different answer if you're talking to a brand guy, or if you're talking to somebody from one of the major brands. The way that I put it though is because I've sold name brands for years, produced name brands for years, and the sentiment that I'm catching from especially your newer private practice owners, also practices that have been around for a while that have started to see a change in patient mentality, there's not as much interest in Lens name brand. Now, there is going to be a lot of interest in Lens name brand for a certain segment of the population, but the truth is 9 out of 10 times that name brand emphasis from the patient side came from the private practitioner side because they were branding their practice as a practice who sold XYZ brand.
Interesting.
So for newer practices who recognize that at the end of the day, like you want your private practice to be the brand for your patient. I wouldn't want my patient to be somebody who recognizes ABC brand. Oh, I can get that from these 5 other places down the road. I want to be the brand for the patient because in my private practice and my independent business, I want to be here for the long run, and branding around patient care and quality is where that's at. So I think there's a lot less care for it these days in certain segments, most segments in my experience, but it's really going to be driven by the practitioner and how comfortable they are as a business owner in branding themselves versus leaning back and relying on the branding of major corporations.
Yeah. Interesting. So, and in some cases, you're seeing that it's not necessarily patients are asking, they're not demanding certain brands. It's more of the practice is branding itself as the provider of certain brands. And that's really where patients are becoming aware of it, or at least feeling like it's something that's important.
Yeah, on the lens side in particular. Of course, with frames, it's a different story because you do have branding on the frame itself, but you don't have branding in the lens. And I think one thing I'll throw out there, the average patient, according to some poll that I heard about years ago, and who knows if these polls are ever actually true, but I found this to be true in practicality. The average consumer who's not intimately familiar with the optical lens world believes that there's one main type of progressive. There's over 1,000. They just don't know that because they don't see it. So no wonder when they go into a practice versus this other practice down the road, they may say, oh, wow, your prices are so expensive, because they're assuming it's the same exact product when it's not.
Got it. I've had similar conversations about the ways that practices should present themselves and brand themselves with vision plans, in that rather than sort of allow themselves to be presented as the middleman between the patient and their vision plan, to make sure that they are positioning themselves as the valuable part of that relationship, and the vision plans are simply a cog in the practice's wheel, rather than the practice being a cog in the vision plan's wheel. And some of the conversations I've had over the last week, we were just at Vision Expo, and because a lot of times patients are just looking at, who's on the website for their vision plan, and then finding someone from there. And if allowed to, the practice can just be seen as sort of this cog and this middleman between the patient and in that vision plan. And it kind of seems like it can be a similar thing between a patient and a practice and the brand of either a lens or a frame, in that if the practice is presenting themselves as the core piece of the core valuable part in that relationship with the patient. And these other things are simply a tool that the practice uses to serve the patients, then that's how they're going to stick in the minds of the patients. Does that resonate? Does that sound like it's something that you've been seeing and talking about? Does that sound about a good summary of what you've been thinking about in terms of how practices should be positioning themselves with their patients and how their relationships with their labs should work?
100%. It's interesting that you bring that up, because Dan was just sharing some statistics with me. As Dan knows how to pull information out from an industry perspective that even after being in the industry for 15 plus years, I never even came across. So just spot on with what you're saying, Evon. From an insurance perspective, of course, it's easy to have this perception that this practice is just a servicer for me as a patient.
Right.
And maybe that's because that's how the insurance plan is set up, because that's how we think of it in the medical world. If you drop my insurance, I'm just going to the next drop down on the website and figuring out who's within 5 miles. And then we move on with our lives. For a private practice to really gain loyalty, they need to think a little differently, to your point, I think. It's the same thing on the lab side. And not every lab and not every practice is going to come at it from that perspective. They're going to sort of be carried on the sales of a brand name. And we try not to do that. Collier Optical Lab, we try not to be that way. We want to form relationships, just like the private practice. Talk to any private practice owner, essentially, and they're going to tell you that really at the end of the day, even if they're sort of in that heavy brand name and insurance-based world, what they really want is solid relationships with their patients that create longevity. Because what does every business owner want? They want their ideal patient or customer. They want to attract them. They want to retain them. That's how you make a successful formula for a business, is attracting and retaining your ideal customer. So the stats that Dan came up with recently or came across had to do with, I won't even try to quote them. Dan, what was that you were looking at recently
Dan,
about how much
what have you been
practice?
Yeah. So
gross?
Yeah. So few stats that we share with optometrists, and these are national industry statistics. And I think it helps the optometry owner to figure out the direction and also figure out the relationship between private pay, insurance pay, and obviously, so-called dispensing revenue. So when we look at an average practice in the United States, the billing to the insurance company is about $1.3 million. Now the received is about $850,000. So we're looking at a gap of almost $450,000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's something that, is subject to examination to figure out what that actually is. Now, we also look at what is the average patient visits per year, which is about, say, $2,500 to $3,500. $2,500 to $3,500 visits per year per practice, which averages about $293 per patient visit. So what does that actually mean to the practice? We're talking about patient retention. We're talking about net profitability. We're talking about growing the business, investing back into the business, so patients are coming back. So we start in these statistics. So the optometry owner figures out, like, okay, well, where do I fit into this? Where are the gaps in my profit and loss and balance sheet? What can I improve? What can a laboratory help me do in order to improve, my bottom line? How can they help me improve my patient retention? How can they improve the quality of a lens that I put onto the patient's eyes? So that's where we start. So I'll leave the stats of that, and Ben, you can carry on.
Yeah, there's a lot that can go into those statistics too, because part of that can be how are you improving that revenue per patient, so that even if you're not accelerating the growth of the patient volume, you're still increasing your revenue per patient. And the other is, how do you continue to retain those patients that are coming in and keeping them happy and allowing them to be ambassadors for your practice and sharing the word with their family and friends. And how does a lab fit into that in terms of what patients expect from from their practices in terms of turnaround time and getting their frames in a timely manner? And how does that part of that patient experience depend on or is impacted by having a good lab relationship?
There's really two things I'm thinking of along those lines. One is quality, and two is choice, really. So when you're really focused on the quality of what you want your patient to be in, they didn't come to you so that a website could tell them that there's 3 or 4 choices of lenses that they could choose from. They came to you as a practice owner so that they could get a really killer eye exam and then walk out of there being able to see the way that you, as the doctor, the practitioner, wants them to see. So just on one level, does it make sense to have a third party telling you that you can only sell these lenses within these ranges? Or does it make more sense just on a basic level to have the choice to put your patients in what you feel is going to be the absolute best option? Sometimes those two things can happen simultaneously. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, but being able to attract and let's talk about retention first. If you're really putting your patients in the quality lenses and products that help them see the way that when they're in the exam chair, this is my perfect exam, and this is how I want you to see when you go out of here. Are you sure as a practice owner that that's what they're getting at the end of the day? If you are, you're going to have an easier time retaining those patients. If it takes it to the next level where you keep those patients coming back and you've retained them, now let's take it up a notch and focus on what it takes to attract the next group of those patients. And from a basic standpoint, if you were to do a Pareto analysis on any practice, you'd look at an 80-20 analysis of how we're running our practice. Where are we? What is the 20% of our practice that's creating 80% of the revenue or the profitability, the net profitability, really? Because most likely, most practices fall into that, where only 20% of your activities are accounting for 80% of your results. So what are those? Start to then drill down and focus on those results, which are, I almost guarantee you, going to have to do with private pay patients rather than insurance contract patients.
Interesting.
And let's focus a little more on that so that we can now start to attract that ideal customer.
Interesting. So you're what you've seen is you're very likely to see that the private pay patients are going to be providing the most profitable interactions. When you think about revenue per patient, it's really an average across your patient base. So you're saying that it's most likely the case that those private pay patients are going to be providing much of that profitability compared to the insurance pay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dan's been doing some analysis on moving forward, what Collier Optical Lab is going to try to do to help really push that per patient revenue and take it up a notch. And it's not just about selling lenses for a cheap price, because we're nowhere near the least expensive lab in the country. We don't even try to be. It's about doing things in an intelligent way. So Dan's been working up some numbers on how are we going to kick it up a notch and help practices increase their patient revenue, but really at the end of the day, their net revenue, the net profitability, excuse me.
Yeah. And who is you talk about like ideal customers, ideal patients, ideal clients. Who is the ideal best fit for an independent lab? Like who is the best fit for that type of relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as any business should do, you're always writing up, or hopefully you've done this as a practice owner, who your ideal customer is. So on the lab side for Collier Optical Lab, our ideal customer who we're really targeting is private practice owners with between 1 and 3 doctors on average. A little bit larger is fine, but typically our target market is going to be smaller to medium-sized private practices, 1 to 3 doctors who are very much focused on patient care and patient quality, on lens and frame technology, and who are not bought into or I guess I would say beholden to the insurance system by more than 50 to 60%. There's a big move these days with private practice owners, and I'm sure you've seen it, it's not about getting rid of insurance, because there's a place for having vision plans, and that's going to be here forever. But it's about managing your practice in an intelligent way where you are controlling the destiny of your practice. That's our ideal customer, is the private practice owner who is controlling the destiny of his or her practice.
Yeah. And it's definitely a hot topic. And it's such an interesting, to me, again, someone looking from the outside, and it's such an interesting conversation of what to do with vision plans, because some would say that there's absolutely a place. It can be seen as sort of a marketing cost, and you just have to evaluate each one and evaluate their profitability and make informed decisions, exactly like you said. And then there are others on another side that say it's best for independent optometry to sort of cast off the relationships with those plans altogether and having just complete control over the pricing of the services and the way that you work with patients. So there's opinions on all sides, and I don't know that there's a right one or a wrong one. It's just there's definitely a lot of ways to handle those relationships. And as I'm talking with you again for the second time, it seems like that doesn't stop at the vision plan. It seems like that definitely continues on, sort of that searching for the right vendors and partners and people to work with within a practice. That definitely extends to the lab and seeing, okay, does an independent lab make sense? Does a larger lab make sense? How do you manage those different relationships? Because it seems to me the relationships that an optometry practice has definitely influences the decisions that an owner can or can't make in their practice. Yes. Ben, like, what are some things about lab relationships that practice owners should know and keep in mind that you found that most don't know or don't entirely understand?
So a couple of things I wanted to mention to this conversation I think is important for when we work with optometry practice, we look at it as a business to business relationship, right? It's a business owner talking to a business owner. So that's important because we're forging a partnership and we want to make sure that both of us are successful because we're obviously fully dancing partners. Now, geography, demographic, and different factors within, let's say I cover the Western United States. It's a different market than East Coast would be. So we tailor, yes, statistics are still the same, but approach can be very different. So I think a lot of, to answer your question is, what are the labs, what are the optometrists can have, which they may not see is, one is we focus a lot on communication and tailoring the ordering process of lenses. That one improves efficiency. Okay. Number two, it decreases remakes. Okay. And number three, it also decreases the administrative cost around that process where a lot of optometrists don't recognize. So for example, if let's say an office manager keys in orders for the day, there may be a secondary person who oversees that and does dual checks. Then the order gets submitted. We check for the quality. We check for the accuracy, and then everything goes into production. So we reduce the errors as much as possible. Obviously, we're all human, but we reduce that tremendously. So now you look at the other dimension of that is you getting better lenses faster, and the patient is happier because they're getting their frames a lot faster than they thought they would be.
Right.
And so we work very heavily to decrease the time it takes by putting in specific communication channels. Obviously, we have a great software. Ben's been working on that for the last month to improve those processes. So we're eliminating errors and, everybody's happy along the process. So I think a lot of times, like what I've noticed working with optometrists is they don't always look critically at their process of how their business operates. They may just do it because they've always done it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. But we come in and we're like, okay, let's see what we can do. Maybe we can do things better. Let's eliminate some of the errors. That will improve your relationship, our relationship, and ultimately the entire workflow and obviously profitability at the very end. And we can, look at numbers and see how we're trending. So that's one of the ways we can evaluate our working relationship.
Yeah.
And what are some ways that you've seen that practice owners can improve some of their processes? What are some things you've seen or have been thinking about ways to improve in the practice?
Well, we've seen a lot of improvement with Dan mentioned just internal processes from a lab perspective with the really labs that are in the modern era now, which is most labs these days. There's a really good direct connection between the people in the office who are dispensing and writing the orders up and the lab. And if you can take that connection into the 21st century, because frankly, a lot of practices are still stuck in the last century when it comes to their communication to a lab, that can overcome a lot of errors right then and there. And to Dan's point, what a lot of practice owners don't necessarily proactively look at until it comes up, because it's not a line item on your balance sheet or your P&L, is what is the actual cost of an unnecessary remake? So if your patient comes in and the glasses aren't ready because you just now checked them out and the prescription's a little off, or you scratched it, whatever it may be, or they were bad from the lab maybe, but your patient's in there, now your patient has to come back. How many hours does it take to call the patient, call the lab, put the remake in, make the lenses again, check them again, go through all the whole process, start to finish all over again? A lot of people just don't look at the actual real cost of doing those things. So if we can help minimize those things, then it's a net positive right there. But really long term, what we're doing with Collier Optical Lab is we're taking it up a notch from there. I've been doing that sort of training for years. So if your processes are good and your staff are trained well with modern lens and frame technology and principles, you're ahead of most of the rest of the practices. But where we really want to take it up a notch, because there's so much, we all know that there's massive consolidation, private equity, all sorts of factors weighing in on private practices, making it in some ways more and more difficult to compete. So what we're trying to do is what we're really going to do and already doing with some practices is let's take a look at your profitability. Are there ways that, yes, we're a lab. Nobody's used to hearing this kind of talk from a lab. It's just, we make lenses, you pay us lab bill. That's as deep as it gets for most labs. But when we decided at Collier Optical Lab that our target market is private practices with 1 to 3 doctors who are into modern technology and really want to be independent, and they want to be here for the long run, well, it's just like running an independent lab. If I want to be here for the long run, I'm paying attention to every little line item. I know what my cost of goods is on everything that I buy and everything that I sell. I know what it all is all the way down the line, and I'm working to control it in a way that makes sure that we survive. So as a lab, we're partnering with our practices with Collier Optical Lab to help them survive, really, because it is getting more and more difficult to survive for a lot of practices. So let's take a look at your P&L, your balance sheet. Let's do a financial review, because we have somebody with the expertise of 15 years of corporate banking and entrepreneurship, and Dan right here. He can take a look and do a complimentary review of your situation. Let's see if we can help you in some areas. And then even, of course, we've got people like you who go to a much deeper degree and are able to take financial knowledge up to the next level. So we really want to partner with practices on that level. And that's unusual talk for a lab, but it kind of became a necessity when we decided on who is our target market, who's our ideal customer, and what can we do to help them be in it for the long run and stay independent. And that's where we landed.
Yeah. Your independence as a business allows you to have, and your clarity around the type of practices you want to serve allows you to have a deeper relationship there. And I'm sure, as like you said, their success also means your success. So you're diving in there and helping them improve their practices more than probably other lab relationships are. And when you mentioned that most practices are still in the last century with their communication with their labs, like, what does that mean? Can you explain that a little bit more to me?
Yeah, sure. So let's not make a phone call or send a fax to put an order in for a patient. Let's avoid the double type and the room for error and the terrible handwriting when the orders are being mailed into a lab. I mean, we're all these days, software-wise, we're pretty much all up to date in the 21st century to where, especially on the lab side, if you're running the lab well, you're largely automated. So for us at Collier Optical Lab, the order entry process and heading into production to actually make your lenses is automated. So if we're having to stop and have a phone call and take 9 orders over the phone when they could have been inputted on a computer more accurately and faster, frankly, then your orders just aren't getting started as quickly. So, and then also, what's the communication look like back and forth? You know, we have a system set up so to where if I'm looking at patient Smith's order that's already halfway through production but I have a question on it, I can just click a couple buttons and it automatically shoots a message to the customer linked to that patient's order, and they can just automatically respond. There's no playing phone tag. It's just simple. It's automated, and it really helps for efficiency of flow, which in a production environment is crucial. So if we take that and we can boil it down to the practice level, then it helps support the relationship with the lab who's already focused on efficiency and flow.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I just know from my own business, the more things that are manually done and entered, the more time it takes, as you mentioned, and the more waste comes with that, and the more room there is for error. So that absolutely makes sense that helps that production process move along a lot more quickly. As we sort of wrap up here, you know, what should practice owners take away in terms of reviewing their own lab relationships, reviewing what works for them and their patients? How should they evaluate their own relationships and make decisions on where to go from there?
So I think number one is the first takeaway is understand where your business is relative to average business in the United States. And I think it's a very valuable statistic. And we provide that. And I think that really sets the foundation for the optometry owner to say, well, you know, I'm actually doing $500,000 more than the average practice. Great. Well, let me look at the profitability. I'm actually not as profitable per patient as I should be. Okay. So let's expand on this and figure out what can be done in order to maximize the profitability, patient care, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the data is, I would say, number one takeaway. I'd say the number two takeaway, especially from my lens, no pun intended, the type of work that I do for Collier is really zone in
optometry on puns are fun.
Really zone in on the communication with not only with the lab that you're working with, but also your internal processes. How do they look like? Is it organized? What are your remakes? What are the issues that patients are having? You know, are they getting their lenses and fittings in the time they promised that they would be? Because that, at the end of the day, is a very critical point in running a business. So I think those are the two key ones that I work on a lot, and I think those are very impactful for any practice. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the next generation of independent labs, is highly focused on partnership and mutual profitability. And a lot of people don't like talking about profitability because there's this stigma to talking about money and profit sometimes. But if you're in business, you need to be profitable. If you're not profitable, you're not going to be in business for very much longer. So we do need to have that conversation. Now, practice owners are not they're not accustomed to having that conversation with their lab. The reason we're having that conversation at Collier Optical Lab with our practices is because we want to all be here for the long run. The lab can, as one of the largest cost of goods in a private practice, the lab can really make or break a practice's profitability. But it's not just from the lens and cost standpoint. A lot of practice owners make the mistake of trying to beat their lab up on price, and that's their method of controlling their cost of goods. But there's a lot more a lab can do for you when it comes to making sure that the practice itself is running efficiently as it relates to communicating with and ordering from a lab. And then the other component that I would leave with you is there's no strings attached. That's one of the best and most difficult parts about being an independent lab is Daniel and I and Sarah, my wife and business partner, we have no contracts. We have no insurance. We don't do agreements with customers. We just make lenses for them and provide additional services to help them become profitable and stay profitable and survive in this environment. So as a practice owner, I would recommend that everybody takes a look at what companies do you order from where there are strings attached. Because whenever there's strings attached, typically your cost of goods ends up being surprisingly higher. You would think that a string being attached means it's lower. It's often not. So take a look at what companies you have in your portfolio as a private practice owner where you're beholden to order from this or that company for whatever reason. Evaluate that. We can help you evaluate that. Obviously, we have a good recommendation for you if that's the case. But evaluate that, because if you think about your practice, think about your lab relationship from the perspective of your relationship to a private pay customer. If you want to hold on to that private pay customer, he or she has no strings attached to your practice other than you're doing a great job and you're going to keep doing that great job. That's the kind of lab relationship you want. A lab who's going to do a great job because they have to earn and retain your business. That's the kind of lab you want to work with.
Yeah. And one last question I think might be a bit of a fun one is, what are you seeing on the horizon in terms of technologies or in terms of lenses? Just what are you seeing coming up on the horizon or in the future of your work?
Oh yeah, good question. Well, actually this month we're going to be installing the new Near Edition lens, the NAL they're calling it, Omnilux lens, which is I don't even know how to describe it very well yet. So I should probably brush up on it before I start selling it, but I've heard great things about it. It's built from the ground up, different than a progressive, doesn't require a fitting height, which is very different from a progressive. But I've heard great reviews. So actually this week I'm having a conversation with that company and I'm going to be installing that lens. So there's some new lens technology coming out, which will be interesting.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate both of your time. This was a lot of fun for me. It's always fun to have independent businesses that are working to make independent optometry practices better, to help my clients get better in their businesses. So it's always fun to have conversations with people like you, because ultimately the more information like this we can get out, the more new ideas that we can get out, I think that's ultimately a benefit to optometry. So really appreciate both of your time. Where can people find you and follow you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, head to collieroptical.com and get in touch with us that way.
I appreciate it. I appreciate both your time. And for the listener, really appreciate you listening. We will catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.